Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane. I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts, and I'm so excited to have Graham Watson back here to talk about his book about Charlotte Brontë, which is, like I said, just wonderful. This is his second time here. We had such an amazing conversation a few months ago that we had to have him back. I know you all had lots of questions as we waited for him to get into the Zoom, and I gave a lot of misinformation, Graham, while we were waiting for you. So I just want to let you know that you're going to have to fix a lot of of that because I got Charlotte Brontë and Jane Austen confused, and I
Oh
messed up.
dear.
Yeah, yeah, terrible, terrible. I feel like I have to give up my librarian card.
Points off. Points off. Okay,
Okay.
should we take some of the initial questions what
Yes.
shall I tell you what I was going to do tonight? Tonight, welcome back everyone, and thank you for all those who stayed with my technical issues. But tonight I was going to talk a little bit about researching my book, The Invention of Charlotte Brontë, and maybe look at some of the manuscript material that I uncovered. But we can also take lots of questions because the last time we did this, I mean, as you know, we had lots and lots of questions. We ran out of time. So I'm happy to start with questions and then we can go back into the presentation if you think there was pressing matters, pressing Bronte questions that needed to be addressed. I'm happy to do that just now. So let's have a look. Someone's saying Charlotte never gave birth. That's right. The baby died. She never carried the baby to full term. Um,
So let me go
uh,
back a little bit,
yeah,
Graham, so you don't have to read through them all. But there was I had said that Charlotte's sister destroyed her letters. That and then somebody else said that that was not true. That was Jane Austen.
that's Jane Austen. Yeah, you're thinking of Cassandra Austen, who destroyed Jane's letters. She destroyed all the interesting ones, actually, so that to thwart biographers. But what you're thinking of, Mina, is something that happened very similarly with Charlotte Bronte, in that other people destroyed her letters. Her best friend, Mary Taylor, I think that we talked about that last time, that her friend Mary Taylor destroyed all of Charlotte's correspondence and left just a single letter and then regretted it later. So we did have a sort of Cassandra Austen episode with Charlotte Bronte. So that's what you're thinking of. So you're almost there, almost there.
Okay, and then there was a question about if Charlotte or Emily died first, and if Charlotte burnt Emily's letters.
Oh no, that's very interesting. So Emily Bronte died in 1848, December 1848. Charlotte died in March 1855. So she lived later, for a few years longer than Emily. There's always been a suspicion that she did destroy manuscripts, especially a second manuscript by Emily, a second novel by Emily Bronte. But I can tell you that it's a myth. So there is no evidence at all that there ever was a second novel by Emily Bronte. It's in quite a few reputable biographies, but as part of my research for my book, I had to trace all of the received wisdom back through other biographies, as well as looking at first-hand written record material, so letters, diaries, journals, and papers by people who were alive at the time, and by the Brontes themselves. I looked through all the biographies as well because I knew the Brontes, like Jane Austen, are people who are sort of enmeshed or frozen in myth. They're
Mhm.
embedded in mythology. And it's often difficult for readers, I think, to separate out what is the myth and what is the fact. And the way I think of it is that there's almost two timelines. There's the historical record that comes from the people who were there, the written sources of letters and manuscripts, and then there's a cultural reception that happens after the publication of Elizabeth Gaskell's Life of Charlotte Bronte. That's when we see the myths beginning and people start to echo each other and make assumptions, and then those assumptions start to grow. So the idea that Charlotte may have destroyed material by Emily and Anne is something that many Bronte fans are familiar with. And I see lots of sometimes very angry responses from people who say things like Charlotte was the bad sister. She was this sort of vengeful, a pyromaniac, almost destroying manuscripts. Now, you might be surprised to learn that there's not a single piece of evidence for this at all. Um, it began with a writer called Clement Shorter, who wrote a biography of Charlotte Bronte in the 1890s called Charlotte Bronte and Her Circle. And in that book, he wonders where the Emily and Anne manuscripts might be, and then just decides someone must have got there first, and that someone must be Charlotte Bronte. Now, his intention behind that was to sell those manuscripts. What the public didn't know was that he was actually gleaning them from survivors of the Brontë family, sometimes stealing them and then selling them on the open market. So it was his frustration at there being a lack of material that he could sell that led to him blaming Charlotte Brontë for destroying them falsely. That entered into the public imagination and has been repeated ever since. And it's become embedded as part of the cultural personality of Charlotte Brontë that she was this jealous destroyer. It's just simply not true. So when we go a little bit further back into Charlotte Bronte's lifetime, looking at the 1850 period in which my book is set. So my book is set, for those who were here before, I'll just repeat some of the things that I mentioned previously. My book starts in 1850. So after all of Charlotte's siblings have died, after she's published Jane Eyre and Shirley, before she's published Villette, her last novel. And it focuses on the friendship she has with Elizabeth Gaskell. But in that period, right at the beginning of that period, in 1850, she was preparing a new edition of her sister's novels, Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey. And she'd been asked by her publisher if she could provide other material to make this new edition different to all the other edition that existed previously, the first edition. Charlotte then said that she was going to look for other work by her sister. So she started going through their papers. And from her descriptions, from her correspondence with her publisher at the time, we can understand what material existed. So she only found poetry. She found some contracts with their publishers, but she didn't find any prose. She didn't find other novels, for example. And if there were other letters from Emily and Anne, they didn't survive. So what we don't know is whether there were letters from Emily and Anne to each other that existed at that point, or from them to Charlotte that existed at that point. I don't think there was, because the family seemed to be in the habit of throwing away letters. Now that seems to be, it feels like an outrageous thing to do, but it was akin to deleting your inbox or deleting your sent items, or it was just a way of keeping things tidy. Not everyone kept all of their letters like they were going to be archived. So that certainly is the case with Charlotte. Some people did keep all of her letters. Some people didn't keep any of her letters. So it's impossible to say whether there were many other letters. Interestingly, Emily says in a letter to Ellen Nussey that she doesn't write letters at all, or that she'd only written one letter before. That can't be entirely true, but what she might have meant was that she wasn't a habitual correspondent like Charlotte and her friend Ellen Nussey were, writing to each other almost every 24 hours. Certainly we only have a handful of letters from Emily and Anne, and we have almost 50 letters from Branwell, with far more from their father, who wrote to parishioners and other clerics and various other people. But by far, the largest correspondence we have in the Brontë family is from Charlotte. We have several hundred letters by her. Yes, someone's saying people wrote very intimately to close friends and family. And so many people didn't want their letters to survive. This was akin to having your text messages preserved. Not everyone wanted that, and I don't think everyone would want to display their WhatsApp messages to the world. So it was a bit like that. People didn't feel there was a value to keeping things like that. We're grateful that they did, that some people did, but not everyone did. So what I'm saying is there isn't really a mystery about it. It was just a part of the habitual nature of correspondence at the time.
So I'm just going to go back a little bit, and we kind of caught up with like I said, my misinformation in the chat. But if you all have questions, please put them in the Q&A, which is a button at the bottom of your screen, and I'll try to pay attention to both. But I do want to go back, Graham, to just sort of like a quick overview. So let's talk about what is the book about. And then we'll go into the topic of today, and then I'll intersperse some questions throughout as they apply to what you're talking about.
Okay, this is my book, The Invention of Charlotte Brontë. It might be reversed in the image here,
nope,
but anyway, this is the US edition. It's been published in paperback in the UK, looking like this, this year also. So my book, you might wonder why another book about the Brontes, because haven't we heard it all already? That might be what people think. Well, no, we haven't heard it all. My book is about Charlotte Bronte's last 5 years. It looks at a pivotal period in her life when she's a single woman for most of that point, becoming a celebrity, becoming a famous writer, and really starting to try and forge a life on her own. She lived with her father, but I mean on her own without her siblings. It was the beginning of her celebrity. And what's crucial about that period is that she became friends with Elizabeth Gaskell, who was a famous novelist. Well, a well-known novelist. Famous, maybe not so much, but she was certainly a successful novelist. She admired Charlotte Brontë, and Charlotte Brontë admired her. But when my book begins at the moment they meet. Why is that important? Because Elizabeth Gaskell, after Charlotte Bronte's early death, would become Charlotte's biographer. Now, Elizabeth Gaskell published a biography of Charlotte Brontë called The Life of Charlotte Brontë, but 2 years after Charlotte died, just 2 years. Now, it's remained one of the most controversial biographies ever written. People still argue about how true this book is. It's had a kind of paradoxical reputation in terms of its impact within English literature, in that people see it as a valuable first-hand source and also as unreliable. Critics and historians have never been able to make up their mind. Is this a true account that we can rely on, or is it romanticized? Is it full of mythology? Was the research reliable? And remarkably, I'm actually the very first biographer to investigate that side of it. Because normally in Brontë or even Gaskell biographies, this is sort of, in Gaskell biographies, it's sort of stepped over because the biographers tend to talk about Gaskell's novels. And in biographies of the Brontes, sometimes it is mentioned, but generally they end at the death of Charlotte Brontë. That seemed to be the natural conclusion to a story. So I really wondered, how did the Brontes' lives transmit into history? How did they become stories? I mean, imagine all of our everyday lives becoming a narrative that people repeat, and then there's sort of canonical details and speculative details. There has to be a process of transmission from one person to another, and then information's added, the story's expanded over time, much is reconsidered. How true is it? This is the process of all history, really. Mm-hmm. And the best kind of history, as I've always thought, returns to the written record and looks at sources and says, what did people really say? Rather than paraphrasing or interpretation, what did the participants and the witnesses actually say? And this is what really interested me about this particular moment in Charlotte Bronte's life, when Elizabeth Gaskell came to write her biography. Because it was so controversial, we had to wonder whether there was, what her influences were, who she spoke to, how did she speak to them, how reliable was her information, what were her intentions. So I began to investigate this, and this is the story of my book. My book, as I say, looks at Charlotte's last 5 years, her death, and then Gaskell researching and writing Life of Charlotte Brontë, and then the media scandal that is detonated by that book. So it was massively controversial when it appeared. So controversial that the first edition had to be banned by the publisher, because so many people complained, so many people who'd been named or identified in the book threatened to sue the publisher for slander. Mm-hmm. And Elizabeth Gaskell and her publisher were faced with a quandary. Either they went to court and defended all of Gaskell's claims, or they appeased everyone who was making complaints. Now, this is where we can start talking about the received wisdom. The received wisdom is that Gaskell was exposed as being someone who had made up the details she didn't know, that her witnesses were unreliable, and that the book is full of errors that she had to correct. What I found in the course of my research was something else that was a bit more challenging, that means that we can't accept that at face value anymore. And that was that Elizabeth Gaskell was essentially coerced into making a false confession that her witnesses were misleading her. Behind the scenes, she was saying in her correspondence to her publisher that everything she said was true and her witnesses were reliable. But for the public, she had to have a different perspective in order to appease the lawyers. Mm-hmm. So essentially, she had to say, it's my mistake, my fault, I was misled, let's say no more about it. It could have been a very costly court case, which her publisher knew they would not win, because they would be up against people who could have limitless resources to defend themselves and could write much off as hearsay. Gaskell knew this, too late, actually. The problem with this was that Elizabeth Gaskell had set out to offend people. She wanted to offend those she slandered. She deliberately said to her publisher that she was going to slander people. And she asked them if they knew much about libel laws. Should have been a warning to her publisher, but they didn't take her seriously until the chaos erupted and people started to complain. Now, I do regret that they didn't go to court, because it would have been one of the most sensational trials of the 19th century. We'd actually know much more about the Brontes. But what Elizabeth Gaskell knew was that she would have to draw on witnesses who were perhaps people who were disenfranchised, people on the outskirts of the population, poor people, women who'd been servants, women who were working as governesses, all of whom had given testimonials to Elizabeth Gaskell. And she thought that the experience of going to court would be hugely distressing and disruptive to them, and probably would fail anyway. So she thought that this would ruin many other lives beyond her own. How do I know this, you might be wondering? Because it's all spelled out in letters she has with her publisher, where they're both trying to work out what they're going to do to diffuse this scandal. And the end result was that an apology was made by lawyers on Gaskell's behalf, admitting failure. And that essentially the line was drawn there, and that was seen to be the conclusion to it. And the opinion that was formed at that point was that, yes, Gaskell had been misled by her sources. Much of what she'd written was exaggerated because she was a novelist and couldn't help writing fiction, and so on. Now, I challenge all of that and say, what are the sources? How do we know they were unreliable if we take that at face value? And I found that actually the opposite picture emerged, that Gaskell had been diligent and judicious, and that her witnesses were credible, and that we can demonstrate that what they said was true. Mm-hmm. So that disrupts everything else that we've come to think about the Brontes. My book is the story of two women defending each other, essentially, against the odds, and ultimately being silenced by the powers they tried to expose. Mm. So this is a new perspective on this story, which is, again, it's been presented to us by historians as an open and shut case. Gaskell got things wrong. That's all there is to it. And what I'm saying is that's not the whole story. She was made to say that to save her publisher a lot of money.
Mm-hmm. So let's go a little bit into the relationship between Charlotte and Gaskell. It's Elizabeth, right?
Yes.
Because that obviously was really important. But I also want to definitely get into your research. So let's start with that, and then go into the research, and then the next thing, whatever that'll be.
Yeah, sure. So Elizabeth Gaskell was born in 1810, so she was only 6 years older than Charlotte Brontë. And often history and legend have portrayed Elizabeth Gaskell as a much older maternal mother hen, essentially, to Charlotte Brontë. She's often known as Mrs. Gaskell. Interestingly, in my research, I found she didn't publish under that name. That's part of the myth. So in later life, she did become known as Mrs. Gaskell, but she actually published all her novels anonymously. Just as the author of Mary Barton and North and South. So she, like all of literary England and America, actually, was fascinated by Jane Eyre when it was published. Everyone was reading that book. Everyone was scandalized by it. Some people were upset by it. Some people thought it was quite a racy, quite a dangerous book. There's one reviewer who said, don't let your wives or your servants read this book because they'll get ideas about power and imbalances, and there were lots of men who were quite concerned. One reviewer said that this book has the spirit of the French Revolution about it. What they meant by that was that in Jane Eyre, the character, is disrupting power hierarchies. She's really a nobody in life, and yet she's challenging all the authorities, the church, schools, landowners, everyone really, because she feels she has the right as a human being to have that power. So this troubled a lot of people, and it scandalized society. A lot of people wondered whether this book was written by a man or a woman. It was published under the name Currer Bell, not Charlotte Brontë. So many people thought the name was bogus. It didn't sound like a real name. So they wondered whether this was perhaps an already known writer hiding in plain sight. Could it be someone like Dickens or Thackeray who'd published this book under an assumed name? That was a good guess on some people's part, because those writers did publish under pseudonyms. They did work under false names. Many people did. Thackeray, for example, had 9 different names that he wrote books under. So sometimes when we think of the Brontes publishing under their false names, Currer, Ellison, Acton, Bell, we might think that that was a sort of expedient measure or something quite unique to them, but it wasn't. Everyone was doing it at the time. So the hunt was on to find out who Currer Bell was and what kind of person this was. Were they respectable? Were they not? Well, the short answer to this is that Charlotte Brontë was eventually exposed, and by an American, incidentally, who was an expatriate from Haworth, who'd moved, Haworth being the town where the Brontes grew up, and had moved to America and recognised locations in the Bronte novels and wrote to his local newspaper. And he was right. He was absolutely right. I think I might be the first to identify this man through American newspapers of the time. It's part of my research, which I'll come on to. But anyway, how did Elizabeth Gaskell and Charlotte Brontë meet? Well, they were introduced by letter by a mutual friend, a woman by the name of Lady Janet K. Shuttleworth, who was among those who was curious about the author of Jane Eyre, and she turned up on the Brontë parsonage doorstep when she heard that the author of Jane Eyre was none other than the daughter of a parson living in this very small, remote Yorkshire town. She wanted to be friends with her because she knew the author of that book must be a sensational person. So she wasn't quite prepared for Charlotte Brontë, who was not at all sensational. Lady Janet K. Shuttleworth also knew Elizabeth Gaskell, and she felt after meeting Charlotte Brontë that she could do with a good friend. And she thought her good friend would be Elizabeth Gaskell. She wrote to Elizabeth Gaskell. Gaskell, of course, was curious about who Currer Bell was and desperate to know. So she told her that she felt that Charlotte Brontë could do with a friend and that maybe they could start corresponding with each other. So she linked them by letter. They started to write to each other. And then about a year later, she introduced them in person. That's the moment my book begins, actually the moment they shake hands with each other, because I think that's the clinching moment. Because their correspondence might have faltered at some point, but Gaskell was determined to work out who this woman was and what kind of person she could be, what was her background, what was her education. Elizabeth Gaskell was a married woman by that point. She had already had some of her children. She could go on to have 4 children, but she was a successful journalist. She, in many ways, was almost like the opposite of Charlotte Brontë. They both come from clerical backgrounds. There was a lot in their lives that was very similar. They both suffered many bereavements. Yet Gaskell's life was on a very much an even keel. She had a stable home life. She was already married and settled, and her career was going very nicely. Charlotte still felt she was striving, still struggling, still trying to make that breakthrough personally and professionally. So when they met in August 1850, it was at a holiday home, the equivalent, if you like, of an Airbnb back then, hired by Lady Janet K. Shuttleworth. She brought them together and they spent a week together talking. And those conversations are actually crucial for everything that was going to happen next. I was able to reconstruct the subject of their conversations from letters that Elizabeth Gaskell wrote to other people as the years went by, when she recalled those moments. And what can we see in those letters? Well, we can see Charlotte talking about her life, talking about her sisters who were then dead, talking about the moorland landscape that they grew up in, the forbidden parsonage, and as she describes it, the mad Irish father, debatable, but that's how she describes him, and a life of hardship. A life lived against luck, against the tide of fate, constantly trying to win some meagre bit of comfort from the harsh surroundings and always failing. Gaskell, as a novelist, was absolutely captivated by this. Now, it's my thinking that Charlotte Brontë was creating a kind of oral autobiography, trying to rationalise all the tragedies of her life and turn that into a story. I think that's what was happening, because other people who met Charlotte Brontë had the same experience. There was one person who met Charlotte Brontë who said, a complete stranger, who said, within 2 hours, I knew her entire life history. She just told me everything. What's crucial about that is that when Elizabeth Gaskell came to write Charlotte Bronte's life story, that's what she remembered, all of those conversations, and then used lots of Charlotte Bronte's letters and discussions with her friends to expand on that. So when complaints began about the book, what she couldn't tell people was that her key witness was Charlotte Bronte herself.
Mm-hmm.
So when someone said, for example, where did Elizabeth Gaskell get that information in her book, she had to say, from Charlotte Bronte. She told me personally. This was uncomfortable for lots of people because they didn't know Charlotte Bronte was narrating the story of her life. Now, we all tell stories about our lives. We all try and make sense of our own lives and our own personalities to other people and make ourselves acceptable or appealing to them by talking about ourselves. We're all entitled to do it. We have a little bit more scrutiny on Charlotte Bronte because she was such a significant figure in the 19th century, and because her story would become so iconic. Everyone, I guess, in the world, I assume, knows something about the Brontes. Even if you haven't read their novels, you can immediately think of the moors, the windswept landscapes, romantic stories, probably swooning on the heath and heather and all that kind of thing. Most of it isn't really true, but it's interesting that we still have those images time after time. Where did they begin? Well, in these stories that Charlotte Bronte told her friends.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that was how they met. So they started to correspond and meet up. They started to visit each other's homes. They stayed with each other for about a week at a time. And again, there were more conversations, and Elizabeth Gaskell got to know her very, very well and admired her. She respected Charlotte Bronte. And someone's asking what I thought of To Walk Invisible. I thought it was amazing. I thought it was absolutely incredible. So there you go. There's a question answered immediately. Yeah. Yes, I'm glad. I actually visited the set of To Walk Invisible, and it was mind-blowing how they reconstructed everything and rebuilt the parsonage on the moors. It's something that still haunts me. And actually, sorry, Mina, I know I'm going off on a tangent, but I'll make this point. There's a new book that's just come out called Let Me In, The Brontes in Bricks and Mortar. And it's by the principal curator of the Bronte Parsonage Museum, Anne Dinsdale, and Sharon Wright, who, Let Me In's a brilliant book. Yes, it is. What I was going to say is the last chapter is about To Walk Invisible, or rather it's an interview with the woman, Sally Wainwright, who wrote the script and directed it. And it talks about the reconstruction of the Bronte parsonage. They couldn't use the actual Bronte parsonage as it is now, for those who don't know. So they rebuilt the whole thing out on the moors as it was in the 1840s. And I was lucky enough to be able to see it. And I'm still quite haunted by that experience. It was like time travel. It was a very, very odd experience. And even people like Anne Dinsdale felt the same. She felt it was quite a haunting experience. And she talks about that in Let Me In. So it's a book that's just come out. So everyone should get this. I think it's an important book about the Brontes. I actually did a talk with Sharon Wright, the author of that, one of the authors of the book, on Saturday in Manchester. So she won't mind me celebrating her again. But yeah, so Elizabeth Gaskell and Charlotte Bronte formed this very close friendship. They wrote to each other. They talked about their novels. They were both still writing their novels at this point. And they formed a very strong bond. It was all over much too soon. Charlotte was dead within 5 years, and the news reached Elizabeth Gaskell, and she was shocked, really shocked, that Charlotte should have died so young, and began to think that her life had been unjust, that she hadn't reached her potential, she hadn't lived the life that she should have had as someone who was one of the greatest talents of her day. She began to become angry about this. Mm-hmm. And coincidentally, not much later, within a matter of weeks, actually, Charlotte Bronte's best friend, Ellen Nussey, thought that Elizabeth Gaskell would be the perfect person to write a short memoir of her for the newspapers, because lots of scurrilous stories were still appearing in the press at this point. Not knowing that Elizabeth Gaskell had already had the idea to write about her, and history was set. Essentially, Elizabeth Gaskell started researching and writing the life of Charlotte Bronte, which would become one of the most iconic biographies of the 19th century and establish the legend of the Brontes. And as well as making Charlotte Bronte's reputation, it destroyed some others' reputations. So it had a very divided effect on the public. Yeah.
Well, as a Bridgerton fan, I'm not really sure how Lady Whistledown got away with all everything she said, given that situation, you know. But I do want to get into the research that you did because yours was based solely, right, on manuscripts and letters. And one of the things you had said last time that was really interesting was that the manuscripts were some of them were just in pieces. Is that
Yeah, that's
yes?
right.
So how did you find that what you needed to write this book?
So many of the manuscripts, well, some of them are still in private hands, and some of them are in museums and archives around the world. The Bronte Parsonage Museum has a huge collection of manuscripts belonging to the Brontes. The New York Public Library also has some, whereas the British Library in England. Actually, there are Bronte letters in many universities and libraries all over the world, so they are scattered across the world. Um, Essentially, I mean, I didn't have to piece them together myself. Lots of scholars before me have managed to transcribe some of them, and actually, all of Charlotte Bronte's letters have been transcribed now, and all of her father's as well. But there are still some emerging. I mean, every so often there will be an auction, and new material appears. In fact, it was just a few years ago that the last and largest private archive of Bronte manuscripts was released to the general public, essentially. And this material hadn't been seen since it was locked away in the 1860s. And amongst them was a poetry notebook by Emily Bronte, which had never been properly examined by critics or historians before. So we now have the opportunity to do a complete work by Emily Bronte. Anyway, to go back to your question, how did I do it? I visited these archives. I wrote to librarians. I asked them to look for specific letters or letters on a particular subject. In some ways, because I was focusing the attention on a particular era, that made their job slightly easier because they could exclude everything else. I've been a lifelong Bronte fan, so I've been reading about the Brontes since I was a teenager. So I had a lifetime of reading behind me. And as part of the research for this, I made it my task to read everything that had been published since Elizabeth Gaskell's biography. And that was obsessive. So I became absolutely obsessed with trying to track down information, looking in newspapers of the time, looking in journals of the time, reading academic papers about them, looking at speeches that people had made afterwards, and then reading all those biographies, the hundreds of biographies that have appeared over the years. And when you do that, you see the myths beginning, you see them being repeated and echoed through time. And then you have the manuscript material and you think, oh, actually, they said that, not this. And that's the thing that people have repeated. Someone might have mistranscribed it and they've got the wrong end of the stick, and something like that's happened. So myths were created through those biographies. I'm not saying they're all bad, they're not. There's many fine and admirable ones. But I decided, well, I asked myself the question, how would we write the story of the Brontes if we didn't have all of those biographies? If we didn't have the narratives and all the stories that people had told about them? Someone has to go, thank you, Amy. So I went back to the original first-hand sources, back to the archives to reconstruct their lives and reconstruct a timeline of their lives as they're played out in letters and correspondence. And from that emerged a very different story. A human one, a messier one, one that doesn't have the tidying up activities of the biographers who came later and decided that certain things wouldn't be mentioned. There it is, and it's sometimes quite ugly glory, but I think so much more interesting than whatever anyone could make up or whatever anyone could clean up. Because you see, there was a cleaning up process that happened through the 19th century as Victorians who were maybe sniffing or clutching their pearls at some things decided not to mention things. Now that we have no qualms about it, so we can return to that material and say, well, this happened. It's a human thing that happened. It's not a bad thing. So we can look at things with oh, thank you. So yeah, we can go back and see the material afresh. So I wanted to do that, strip away all the biographers' voices and go back to the the first-hand sources. What I was going to show you tonight, and I don't know if we'll be able to do it now, but I actually prepared slides for this so I could show you lots of manuscript material as well. But, you know.
So if you don't mind staying until about 3:15 our time, we could probably go
Yeah,
through it in a few questions because I know that people were really interested in the images last time.
sure. Yeah, that's fine. Well, let me see if I can open this up. In fact, because I was thinking I will do a PowerPoint presentation for you and show you all of these photographs and letters. What I was going to show you were the manuscript material, some of the manuscript material that I researched. I was going to show you all the different Bronte handwriting examples that we have of all the members of the family, and how, as you see, some of them were in fragments. So we might have one piece of a letter here and then another piece in another archive somewhere else, and they can go together and we see that they are parts of the same account. Or we have transcriptions of letters by other people who had seen letters and then copied them out, and then the original has been lost. So it was about having a kind of judicious approach to all of that and trying to assemble it into a single record that's coherent and that can then tell a story, essentially. Yeah.
So did you say that you have some slides or?
Yes, we could go to them if you wish. Yeah.
Yeah, let's try that.
Okay. This might crash everything. So, you know,
We'll be here for you,
keep that in
Graham, if
mind.
it
So,
does.
faithful viewers, if I disappear, you know why. So I'm going to switch. You'll see me switching to my screen. So I'll share screen right now, and let's see if this works. Share. Can you see this? PowerPoint,
Yep.
possibly.
Yep.
You can. Right. Excellent. I'm going to go into the full mode. Hang on, and I will do that. Yep, that's me talking about the research. If it lets me do it, maybe not. You.
I think you should go into slideshow.
Yeah.
There
Yeah.
we go.
Does it work? It might not. Who knows? Ah, there we are.
Yeah.
Yes, there I am talking about that. So I guess everyone can see this slide. That's good. This is my book, as I mentioned earlier, in the UK and US editions. This is the material we're going to be looking at. This is the research material from the written and public archives. So you'll see there's just a massive information in there, and that's really what I was looking at when I began this book. The eagle-eyed will notice up in the right-hand corner, Acton Bell, author of Wuthering Heights. That's not quite right. Acton Bell was Anne Bronte, who wasn't the author of Wuthering Heights. That was Ellis Bell, Emily Bronte. But that goes to show how errors appeared even in public for quite a long time. So this is an example of some of the kind of papers that I looked at. I was going to talk about the two women who are central to this, Charlotte Brontë and Elizabeth Gaskell. This is Bronte Parsonage, this is Haworth. I'm going to skip over very quickly so that we can get to it. I was going to talk about some of the main figures in this story. This is Patrick Bronte, who was the father of the Bronte family, an Anglican vicar from County Down in Ireland, moved to England in 1802, studied at Cambridge, took holy orders, and became the curate of several English parishes, ultimately Haworth, where the Bronte family were born. Well, actually, they were born in Thornton and they were raised in Haworth. The famous portrait of Emily, Anne, and Charlotte Bronte, painted by their brother Branwell, he is in the pillar there. There were lots of conspiracy theories about why that was painted out, but we know that from X-raying the image that the portrait isn't complete and that it's actually probably Branwell's change of plan to paint himself out. That takes us to Branwell, who was the only son of the family. He was a writer and painter, and he imagined that he was going to be an editor or a poet, but ended up frittering away his time as a tutor and a railway clerk. He ultimately died of addictions and tuberculosis at the age of 31. This is Ellen Nussey, who was Charlotte Bronte's best friend and who became essentially Charlotte Bronte's archivist and was a key collaborator with Elizabeth Gaskell. I appreciate I'm going through this very quickly, but so we can get to the good stuff. This is Arthur Bell Nicholls, who was married to Charlotte Brontë for 9 months, the last 9 months of her life. He was also an Anglican vicar who was from Ireland, and had been Patrick Bronte's curate from 1845 until 1861. So he knew the family well. Elizabeth Gaskell, the novelist who I've described, who was the author of Life of Charlotte Brontë. Now, manuscript material from the Brontë family and their associates. I'm going to show you some examples of the individual handwriting of the Brontë family. At the top here, we have an example of Patrick Brontë, the father's handwriting. This is from a letter of September the 5th, 1850. You can see that very firm and very elegant hand that Patrick has. Below it is an example of Branwell Bronte's handwriting with an illustration. The church that's right at the centre of that illustration appears to be the original church that was facing the Brontë parsonage. He's got a very distinctive stylized hand. And the reason I mention these is because people like me who have looked at lots of manuscripts can identify a signature or a piece of writing just from the handwriting without knowing who it's from, because I've seen so much of this. We have at the top here an example of a letter by Charlotte Brontë to Elizabeth Gaskell. She has this very regular right-leaning handwriting that moved in several stages over her life. So we can actually trace 3 stages to her handwriting. This is the late stage from 1852. Ellen Nussey's handwriting is there as an example. You can see she's, in that letter it says, to defend the Bronte's brother, you're in danger of injuring his sisters. This was a late letter that she wrote to someone who was writing about Branwell Brontë. We'll come on to that later. Up at the top, there's Emily Bronte's own handwriting from one of her poetry notebooks. And then similarly, Anne Bronte's handwriting from one of her poetry notebooks. You can see how drastically different they are. And I think it's tempting, isn't it, to read something of their personality into the style of their handwriting and to see something else that's not told by the words themselves. I think it's always interesting when people see the actual handwriting of the Brontes, if they're writers that they admire, because sometimes it's not quite what they imagine. It's something less sophisticated, or sometimes more sophisticated than they imagine. Now, this is Arthur Bell Nicholls' handwriting, who was Charlotte Bronte's husband. This is a really interesting letter, and it was one that I found, and I quote it from it in my book. It's a letter from Arthur to a man called Francis Leyland, who was a friend of Branwell Bronte's. And in this letter, he's declining a request from Francis Leyland to photograph the medallion that you can see in that image there, that's hanging on the parlour wall of the Brontë Parsonage Museum. He's saying that he doesn't have the resources to have it photographed. That's important because it tells us about how cultural interest was spreading about the Brontes after their deaths, and how there was a need to see what they looked like. Here's Elizabeth Gaskell's handwriting. This is actually a letter that she wrote about her concerns for the sanitation of the village of Haworth, that it was poorly sanitised. There was polluted water running off the cemetery into the town. There were open sewers running down the main street. There wasn't a sewage system at that point, and there wasn't proper drainage in the cemetery. So there were toxic fumes essentially polluting the whole area, as well as the fumes from factories. So she was very concerned that it was shortening the lives of people. And health reports, governmental health reports at the time, demonstrate that it was correct. Patrick Brontë was also involved in trying to improve the conditions of people in Haworth, and ultimately water pumps and wells were established, and the town was cleaned up, but not before it had shortened the lives of many of the inhabitants there. We're going to look at some letters from Charlotte Brontë here, just as an example of some of the material that Elizabeth Gaskell saw and then I saw in return. So I was able to use exactly the same artifacts that Elizabeth Gaskell herself had used when she wrote her biography of Charlotte Brontë. When I came to write mine, The Invention of Charlotte Brontë, I found that many of the same letters that she'd used still existed and had been preserved. This is one of them. This is a letter from Charlotte Brontë to Ellen Nussey. It's quite interesting here that you can see there are some names that have been scored out. And this was something that Ellen Nussey did when she decided to give Charlotte Bronte's letters to Elizabeth Gaskell. She thought she would censor them. And then this is a larger letter, but we'll go back to this one. The censoring that Ellen did was Ellen's deliberate attempt to try and conceal information from Elizabeth Gaskell that she didn't want to share. Now, you might look at that and think, well, she hasn't done a terribly good job, because you can quite clearly read the names there. But it shows Ellen's concerns that Elizabeth Gaskell might be given information that she ought not to have. When Elizabeth Gaskell asked Ellen about this, Ellen had decided that she felt it was not really her duty to give away the lives of the people who weren't the Brontes, only the Brontes. This became a bone of contention between Charlotte Bronte's father, ultimately, and Ellen Nussey, because he felt that in some ways Ellen had exposed the details of his family's life by handing over Charlotte's private letters to Elizabeth Gaskell and keeping herself out. She scored out the names of all of her family and asked Elizabeth Gaskell not to mention her by name in Life of Charlotte, which was problematic ultimately, but it meant that Ellen in some ways remained in the shadows as a kind of informant while the Brontes were exposed themselves. And Patrick felt that that was quite an immoral thing to do. It's debatable whether it was or it wasn't, and I can understand why he was upset, but I can also understand Ellen's perspective that she wanted to reveal to the world the family that they were interested in, the Brontes, and not anyone else's family. This 4-page letter, so there's 2 pages in the centre there, comes from November 1854. So this is after Charlotte Brontë has married. November 1854 is, let's see, it's about, well, 4 months before Charlotte dies. Actually, she dies in March 1855. What's telling is that Charlotte is still writing her old name, Charlotte Brontë, and you can see there she's corrected it to Nichols. Habitually, she's still writing Brontë. So the actual artifacts of letters themselves do reveal much, not just the content, but how they're written. Here's something that Elizabeth Gaskell examined and that I was able to look at as well. This is the first 2 manuscript pages of Charlotte Bronte's unfinished novel, Emma. So it was, she worked on it in 1853, and it was unrevised and unfinished by the time she died in 1855. But it does provide a kind of insight into a writing process. This is about actual size. If you're looking at this on a computer screen, I've reproduced these pages as they actually are in reality. They're written in pencil, and you can see there's lots of corrections and scoring out. This is how Charlotte Brontë actually wrote. Now we can compare this to the famous manuscript of Jane Eyre. I've reapportioned these for relative size. So that little manuscript at the top there on the left would be in relation to the size of the manuscript of Jane Eyre. You can see that Jane Eyre is written in a very clear, legible hand and in ink. That was intended for her publisher. That's what's called a fair copy. So the publisher and the typesetters used that manuscript to set the type from which Jane Eyre was printed. But looking back at this manuscript, we see something quite different. This is Charlotte Brontë at work. This is her mind racing. And as she thinks of new sentences, new words, new scenarios, you can see she's going over things again and again. In fact, if you look at the bottom section, you can see it's all scored out. It tends not to be how we imagine Charlotte Brontë. We imagine everything was very fluent with her and that masterpieces poured out of her. But this demonstrates that even geniuses had to approach writing as rewriting. She did speak about her process that she wrote in pencil on scraps of paper. So if you imagine folding an A4 sheet of paper in half and then in half again until you have 4 panels, this is what we have here, 2 of those panels. This is actually the only example of any of the Brontë novels in draft form. We don't have any of the others. The manuscripts of Emily and Anne's novels were destroyed by their publisher. They weren't retained, and they may have thrown away their own draft material, as was normal at the time. Once a book reached its fair copy stage, this stage, authors tended to throw away all their draft material, all their working documents, and then it was typeset and printed, and that became the defining version. So there are quite a lot of novels that don't have manuscript material to correspond to them. We're lucky with Charlotte Brontë that our publisher, George Smith, saw an opportunity to preserve them, and he did. So if he hadn't, Charlotte might not have done it. But these were preserved by Charlotte's husband and ultimately published. It's only the introductory section of a novel, and Charlotte had intended to go back and rewrite it and produce a wider and more comprehensive novel. But it's interesting to us to see Charlotte Brontë at work. We can see her mind going through the process of constructing a story, and as I say, it's the only example we have of a working Brontë manuscript. As well as the manuscript material, I looked obviously at first editions of books. This is the first edition of Elizabeth Gaskell's Life of Charlotte Brontë. It's notable for many things. It has E.C. Gaskell on the title page. This is the first appearance of Elizabeth Gaskell's name in print. But more significantly, it's also the first appearance of the name Charlotte Brontë in print. You can see it's in large letters there. And they've had to put author of Jane Eyre, Shirley and Villette, because up until this point, it was assumed that the author of Jane Eyre, Shirley and Villette was someone called Currer Bell. So this was really absolutely confirming that Currer Bell and Charlotte Brontë were one and the same person. Before that happened, though, Elizabeth Gaskell had to write a manuscript, and here's her manuscript of Life of Charlotte Brontë. These are the first 2 pages of it. It's slightly larger than is depicted here on the screen. But again, you can see lots of scoring outs. You can see lots of changes of opinion. It runs very closely to the printed text. I looked at the actual manuscript of this. The full manuscript is in the Manchester University Library. And I was lucky enough to be able to examine the whole thing. I did check if there was anything that had been missed out from the printed version of Life of Charlotte Brontë. I can tell you there isn't. It's all been captured. Excuse me, but the interesting thing to me was how many redactions there were, how many changes of thought Elizabeth Gaskell had had. We tend not to think of working manuscripts looking like this, especially of classic works. The book had quite a tremendous response when it was published. Here's 2 quotes from Elizabeth Gaskell and Ellen Nussey. Ellen Nussey wondered why so many people were complaining, especially those who were Anglican vicars, saying, "What indeed have the pure and the upright to shrink from? They'll have to face the great searcher of hearts before all the world. Why fear the little world of the present time?" Ellen Nussey was feeling devilish at this point because she wanted to expose what she felt was fairly bad behaviour towards her friend. Patrick Brontë praised Elizabeth Gaskell's Life of Charlotte Brontë, but he did have some complaints that he thought, as I quote here, there were a few trifling mistakes about him and that there were some eccentric movements ascribed to him, which have no foundation in fact. Gaskell, on the other hand, felt that there was much foundation in her descriptions of Patrick Bronte's explosions of temper. Some of the descriptions had come from Charlotte herself. So she felt there was good authority to include them. This is a letter from Patrick Brontë to William Dearden, written around the time of the publication of Life of Charlotte Brontë, a few months later in October 1857. This is not in Patrick Bronte's handwriting. This is written by someone else. So someone else who'd seen the original letter has transcribed the letter as it was, and we only have the transcription now. Patrick says, interestingly, no one should write his life, his being Branwell. I think enough has been said on that head. He was a young man of varied and brilliant talents, but alas, his appetite was stronger than his reason, and thus all his fair prospects were blighted, his life shortened, and great sorrow brought upon his sisters and me. Should anyone undertake to write a memoir of him, he shall have no assistance from this quarter. So this was Patrick saying that no one would be allowed to write a biography of Branwell Brontë. Absolutely no one would be allowed to quote from his manuscript material. Earlier in the letter, Patrick says that he's given all of Branwell's manuscript material to Arthur Nichols, who actually lived in the same house as Patrick Brontë. You can see at the top there it says, "Dear Sir, as Mr. Nichols has stated, I have given to him all Branwell's writings," meaning essentially that no one could get access to them. There was some interest at this point that Branwell was seen as a controversial figure in Elizabeth Gaskell's Life of Charlotte Brontë, and some people wanted to correct that, especially his friends, but Patrick wanted there to be silence. The reason I show this is because William Dearden, whom this letter was written, became quite an important figure in Patrick Bronte's life at one point, because he decided he would just become Patrick Bronte's spokesman and start leaking stories to the press about Patrick, going behind his back. So he was betrayed by William Dearden, who just decided he would become an unofficial biographer. But to complicate it further, William Dearden idealised Patrick Brontë and began the process of whitewashing him and making him a more amenable man, I think in an attempt to get the material about Branwell from him. So it was an attempt to persuade him. As well as manuscript material, there was lots of first-hand information that I could glean from English regional newspapers from the period of 1840 to 1860. We'll look a little at that, but Mina, I'm going to rely on you to tell me when to wind things up. I know that we're hastily speeding towards the end, so I'll go through this quickly. Now, this is an interesting piece. This is a page from the Halifax Guardian of July the 16th, 1842. And on the left there, you can see there's two sections highlighted. If you ignore the top part, the one in the middle that's highlighted that says on Caroline is a known poem by Branwell Brontë. But it's signed Northumberland. This isn't terribly clear, I apologise, but it's just the resolution that I could get from the newspaper. What's telling about this is that Branwell's family didn't seem to know that he had published poems under a false name, which made him the first of the Brontë siblings to be published. For most of the reception period of the Brontes, right into the 20th century, it was always assumed that the sisters were first to be published out of the siblings, Branwell, Charlotte, Emily and Anne, when they published a collection of poetry together called Poems by Currer, Ellison, Acton, Bell. But it was only with research into regional newspapers that we noticed this name, Northumberland. Now, that's a name that Branwell Brontë used in his childish writings. He and his sister Charlotte created an imaginary world called Angria, and Northumberland was a character in it. And also Branwell often signed his name, Northumberland. Sure enough, documentary material has surfaced. This letter appeared, actually, believe it or not, fairly recently, but it mentions that very poem that I've just shown you on the screen. And Branwell says to his correspondent on July 12, 1842, Northumberland has so long wrought on in secret and silence that he dare not take your kind encouragement in the light in which vanity would prompt him to do so. Meaning, Northumberland, this literary identity that Branwell was using, was writing in secret and publishing in secret, and that his friend, who was Joseph Leland, was encouraging him, and that he couldn't accept the flattery and the compliments that Joseph Leland was giving him. But it does demonstrate that, yes, it was happening. So Branwell, as far as we've been able to establish, was the very first of the siblings to publish anything. And he published perhaps up to 15 poems between 1841 and June 1847, regularly in the newspapers. And none of his family seemed to have been aware of it. Not one of them, not Patrick, not his sibling, his sisters, Charlotte, Emily or Anne, mentioned ever knowing that he had published anything. And Elizabeth Gaskell didn't know either. And we know that because she would have mentioned it in Life of Charlotte Brontë. So it remained a secret right into the 20th century, almost to the 21st century, when researchers were able to identify him. And it's only with the digitization of newspapers that we've actually been able to find others. So there he is, Northumberland. Branwell Bronte was the first. He was the first of the Brontes to get into print, and excluding their father, who published earlier. But he was the first of the siblings, and it took quite a long time for Branwell to receive some recognition.
So, Graham, I think probably we need to just start wrapping up.
Okay, I
So
was just going to. That's fine. I'll do that. This is very briefly. This is an announcement of Anne Bronte's death in the York Herald. But again, it shows some of the contextualization that we can make. There's lots of others there, but I'll close that and stop sharing. So, okay, we're back to cameras. That was just a very quick whistle-stop tour of some of the manuscript material, some of the newspaper sources, some of the books that I looked at as well. But what I hope it gives you an idea of is the varied sources that the first-hand material comes from, and how I was able to assemble it all into a wider narrative that gives texture to the real lives of the Brontes, I hope.
Absolutely. And I appreciate you doing the slides, because I know we had talked last time about just having a conversation. But the visual just totally brings it to life. So maybe we need to have a take three. I don't know.
Sure, we can do a take three and we'll go through the whole thing again. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
This poor Graham, he's never going to get rid of us.
No, listen, I love it. It's amazing. It's a great privilege for me to be speaking to you all. So I love it. So have me on every week. I could talk about the Brontes forever. Believe me.
I feel like I totally make that happen. Couple quick questions, and then we'll wrap it up. So, Jill wants to know, did you see any of the little books that they wrote in childhood about their imagined countries?
Yes, I did. So many of them are in the Bronte Parsonage Museum. There's quite a few in New York Public Library as well. And I did see them. I've actually seen them in person, and they are about the size of a stamp. They're very, very small. So if you imagine them being able to be held by dolls, that are about this size, they would have gone with toy soldiers. So we think they made them to fit into their hands originally. Some of them are so small they can only be read with a magnifying glass. But the content they have is gigantic. I mean, they wrote volumes and volumes of them. Most of them, I think all of them actually have been transcribed now. But yes, I did see them, and they're quite something actually to see them in person.
I love that. Charlotte wrote that Anne had but a tinge of religious melancholy, giving her a sad shade. Why do you write the term religious morbidity when the Brontes were raised in the church by a minister's father? Religion didn't really come with illness.
So Charlotte did say that. She wrote that in her introduction to the new edition of Tennant and Wildfell of Agnes Grey, I beg your pardon. And she prefaced both Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey with a memoir of her sisters. And in that, she says, it's a very interesting, actually, piece about Anne Bronte. She talks about Anne, in her opinion, suffering religious melancholy all of her life, and feeling that she was a sinner. She wasn't worthy of heaven or God, essentially. So, essentially, to try and bring this round very quickly, Charlotte felt that Anne was unduly harsh on herself from a religious perspective, and that she was essentially beating herself up over everything in terms of her religious persuasions, and that she was a very virtuous person, but wasn't able to recognize that. And Charlotte was able to see after she died that she'd lived a good and virtuous life, and that she was a true Christian. And she felt that perhaps Anne hadn't allowed herself to be able to see that. So that's what she meant by religious morbidity. She said that Anne suffered at the foot of a secret Sinai, which I think is a beautiful phrase, and that she was waiting for the last trumpet, waiting for Judgment Day, which she felt would occur at any point, and that she would be well judged, and she hoped that she'd be judged well. I think she would have been.
I think so too. And Mitchell wants to know, is Du Maurier's book on Branwell worth reading?
Well, she comes to the wrong conclusion about Branwell Bronte. I'll say that. Everything by Daphne du Maurier is worth reading. However, Daphne du Maurier used material that was only available at the time that has been sort of disqualified because of the expansion of more material. So, for example, she felt that one of the famous things about Branwell Bronte was that that he had an affair with someone, that he was expelled from his employment. because he had an affair with the boss's wife, essentially. Daphne du Maurier thinks that isn't the case and that he might have had an affair with the boss's son. So there's a bit of a confusion. There's no evidence for that. That's just a miscommunication. He did. Subsequent letters have emerged from Branwell in which he talks about having this 3-year relationship with the lady of the manor, Lydia Robinson, and how it was uncovered, and that it ultimately led to him being suspended and then sacked.
Mm.
Decades ago, when Daphne du Maurier wrote her book, that wasn't available, so she had to conjecture, and unfortunately she added 2 plus 2 and got 5. So yeah.
Often happens.
Yep.
Well, thank you so much for doing this again, Graham, and for all of your persistence in getting into the Zoom. Other people have been emailing me saying they had trouble as well. So we will have to try this again when the lightning's not striking or something, and
Yes.
get through the rest of your slides and also more questions because we definitely had to, kind of go through quickly. So thank you all for sticking with us. I appreciate it and your wonderful questions and comments. It really filled out the entire conversation. You're amazing. Graham, I will be in touch.
Thank you. I'll speak to you again soon. Thank you all for coming. Until next time.
Until next time. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Bye.